as interesting, as poetic, as dramatic as I could. I made it into an art form. I produce art now to venerate the greatest god, Djehuty, and in return, my devotion is an art.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander F., and today we are excited to talk about the Church of Flesh and Feather with Reverend Zemmi Djehuty. Reverend Zemmi is the author of the Book of Flesh and Feather, available for pre-order now from Thean Publishing, which is his deeply personal and insightful grimoire to honor and invoke the ever-living source of art and magic, Thoth-Djehuty, in a contemporary Gnostic paradigm. I had the honor of first meeting Reverend Zemmi through the great magician and previous podcast guest, Jack Grail, and I had the privilege to hear about Reverend Zemmi's work surrounding the Book of Flesh and Feather. Reverend Zemmi's tome includes a large number of ritual instructions, exorcisms, spells, amulets, and hymns which invoke the great god Thoth-Djehuty, and the entire ritual cycle in the Book of Flesh and Feather first aims at inducing a necessary state of chaos, after which the theurgist is slowly pulled into the light of Djehuty's gnosis. And concluding the work is an elaborate initiatory ceremony which allows you, the operator, to become the Word of God and go forth as an emanation of the deity. Now, this book is so exciting for many reasons. Number one, because it reflects a deep personal and devotional praxis and evolution of one magician's direct experience with Thoth-Djehuty. So Reverend Zemmi joins us to talk about Thoth-Djehuty, his first contact with the god, why working with chaos in a unique way is critical for personal devotion to a deity, why smashing cookie-cutter instructions is so important, what art really is to a devotee of a deity, and Reverend Zemmi also answers your Glitch Bottle Patreon listener questions and so much more. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, let's welcome Reverend Zemmi. Reverend Zemmi, thank you so much for stopping by the Glitch Bottle podcast today.
Howdy, Alexander. Thanks for having me.
One of the things that is so deeply impactful in the various passages of your book is the total honesty in how you arrived at your path. And you mentioned that the Church of Flesh and Feather began in total chaos, unquote. So can you share with our listeners a little bit about the genesis of this book and where your life was in this total chaos at the time, and share with us about that evolution?
This book began forming in a time in my life where I was, in hindsight, I can say I was having a nervous breakdown, but at the time I was living it. I did not realize that was what was happening. I was wasting away in an alcoholic stupor and drug-induced oblivion, and I was not going anywhere. I was completely directionless. So I was kind of sitting in this pandemonium, basically, with my whole entire life ahead of me, but I was unable to see any of it. I very much needed direction, but I didn't have any strong human relationships necessarily. I didn't have anybody to kind of take me under their wing. Most people's first go-to is their respective gods, but I grew up surrounded by people who sort of demanded, I believe, in God, while they themselves did absolutely nothing to venerate a god. So I just kind of had this God hole in my soul, I guess. I wanted to believe in God, but I could never figure out how to. Something bad would happen to me, and I would, kind of, oh God, why would this happen? I only believed in God when bad things were happening, more or less. I think a lot of people kind of find themselves in that position. But it was in that chaos that kind of through a friend of a friend, I heard about this class that was being offered here in town about pagan worship. And the first image that came to my mind was people dancing naked around a big fire covered in blood and a, big black goat very dramatic stuff, cinematic all the way, and that intrigued me. So I worked my way into that class, and it was basically just 5 or 6 people in Jack Grail's basement. And we were talking about the ancient Greek goddess Hecate. And I was very intrigued. It wasn't, there were no orgies, there was no drug taking, but I was intrigued by this very primal way of worshiping a god. So I kind of just dived into that. But the more I devoted myself to Hecate, the less I felt any kind of connection to her specifically. And I felt guilty about that. I actually thought that I was kind of failing. I was capable of acknowledging her in the real world. I would have experiences with Hecate, but they didn't mean that much to me. I appreciated them, but I couldn't relate to any of it. All this time, I'm still, of course, spiraling emotionally. My wife and I went to a party with our cousins in Missouri, and while we were there, between all of you and me, I don't get along with her cousins that well, so I kind of stayed away from all of them all weekend, and I was just kind of alone in a corner. I was texting Jack and our friend Samuel David about modern synchronicities with ancient religion, discussing Hecate and Hecate's various, epiphanies. I had just started reading the PGM, so I had introduced myself to hundreds of various god names and voces magica, and all of these just really interesting ways of referring to gods.
You mentioned in the book that it was while you were there in rural Missouri on a lake, and you were texting Jack and Sam, and you were kind of thinking about different things, that you experienced a very, very interesting set of circumstances, something with animals of the air and of the earth. Can you kind of share with listeners about what happened and how you went from that state of, I'm on this lake, and then you just kind of had this experience?
Anybody who's familiar with the PGM knows what I'm talking about when I say there are many, many very long, very difficult names. And I was basically sitting there on this lake in rural Missouri, just kind of over and over again, trying to work my mouth around these crazy names. Abramintho, Lextheranex, Ethreluth, Othnemariba, Akramakramari, Ablanathanalba, and all of these long strings of vowels. And I was contemplating the nature of Hecate, specifically her presence in my life. As I was sitting there, everything kind of became extremely still, if not kind of just frozen and silent, and I became super aware of everything moving around me. As I sat there on this back patio looking out over this empty lake, an armadillo waddled up to the porch and just kind of stared at me. And I looked over and I acknowledged the armadillo as representing Sutek, because Samuel David, Jack Grail, and I had just discussed the armadillo in southern Illinois and how it sort of could represent this mysterious set typhon beast. And as I acknowledged the armadillo, I look out over the lake and I see a large black bird with almost like a sheen, like it was covered in petrol, green and pink colors shimmering, holding a snake in its long curved beak. And I knew immediately that that was an ibis, specifically a glossy ibis. Now those are exceptionally rare in the American Midwest, but they are there. They are here. But I had never seen one in the wild before like that. And in that moment, immediately, I sort of felt this huge pressure just lift off of my shoulders. And I kind of I understood what had happened. I had been invoking Hecate in her epithet as the key keeper of the universe. And she led me to the path that I was supposed to go down. Once I acknowledged it, she just backed away And that was the beginning of the Church of Flesh and Feather, Thoth's modern temple in the American Midwest. That was the beginning of the Church of Flesh and Feather. And it was in that moment that my God hole, as I refer to it, filled. I found purpose, I found direction, I found something that led me to a better way of living my life. Now, that's not to say that Thoth, my God, Djehuty, is doing these things for me. That's one thing I had to kind of find out for myself. I am accomplishing everything, but it is in his honor that I accomplish these things. It is because of his presence in my life that I am going back to school, that I have published these books. It's because of his presence, not his actions. It's actually one of the things I've sort of realized about venerating Thoth the way I do, is that in order for him to acknowledge me, I have to find my way to a state of perfection. Only for a moment I'm standing in it. I have to be worthy of him acknowledging me.
It is in the act of the presence of the God itself in your life, just being there, just having a presence there, that presence immediately started animating and imbuing the direction and kind of the kinetics of your consciousness and your investigations and your day-to-day. Is that somewhat fair?
Yeah, absolutely. A God is not a tool, but a God is hardly even a destination, really. As mortals, our interactions with the gods are solely to seek them out. And again, as mortals, rarely do we interact directly with them. That's not to say that I haven't. I certainly have had experiences like that experience on the lake, that I feel as though I have interacted directly with Thoth, but it is always in a state of ritual purity, if not in a state of ecstasy. For the most part, we're interacting with the spirits of the land, the spirits of the air, our ancestors. There is a whole host of titular spirits between humanity and the gods. A god is all-powerful. A god is everything. They don't necessarily have time to listen to us complain about our terrible jobs or help us get vacation time or something like that. However, they can introduce us to the spirits who are basically more open to it.
To that point, Reverend Zemmi, we actually have a listener question for you from Ryan. And Ryan is asking, for me, Ryan says, Thoth-Djehuty is a deity that I've heard a lot about, but haven't had the opportunity to interact with them. Could Reverend Zemmi please tell us a bit about Thoth-Djehuty and how they were first drawn to the god? And so to follow up on Ryan's question, Reverend Zemmi, as you mentioned, you had this first contact with Thoth-Djehuty. But can you share with the listeners, like when you specifically use the two words Thoth-Djehuty, can you kind of share with us, like, why are they used, and just a little bit more to Ryan's point about your initial contact with this god?
Well, with most ancient gods, we don't actually refer to them by their true names. To hold the power of a god's true name is to hold their power themselves. So we know a list of epithets. Thoth and Djehuty are both epithets of the same god. Thoth is just kind of more of a Greek epithet, whereas Djehuty is a little bit more of a traditional Egyptian epithet. I refer to the god as Djehuty solely because I like the sound and shape of that epithet a little more than Thoth, though I do use the name Thoth quite a bit. But it is remarkable how much, this might be a controversial thing to say, but how much misinformation there is regarding the ancient Egyptian gods, especially Thoth. A lot of the information people use to sort of build up their knowledge of these ancient gods all come from edited versions of like the same handful of sources. There is a huge amount of sources from antiquity that have not been translated. But if you translate them all, you'll see these gods referred to kind of all in the same way. So Thoth, Atum, Nephthys, they'll all be referred to as the greatest god, the god above gods. Shishat and Djehuty are both referred to as gods of magic. None of those epithets matter that much. They don't differentiate between these gods. Every god is every epithet, basically. The gnosis of this religion is understanding how to access that god through that epithet.
To follow up on that, Reverend Zemmi, like when it comes to Thoth-Djehuty, I know a lot of listeners are familiar, obviously, with Nomina Magica and a lot of Greek names, a lot of Hebrew names, you know, Adonai, Shaddai, El-Chai, etc. Are you saying as well that it's about taking a specific name and kind of using that as a channel to access a specific facet or a specific manifestation of the god?
This magic or hika, these utterances are about making your way to the power of these names. It's about making your way to these gods through the power of their name. So say you are studying for school and you have a really hard time comprehending something. You can say a prayer. You can invoke Djehuty as the god of wisdom. But at the same time, you could do that with any god. The names don't necessarily matter. So religion is basically like a big bowl of alphabet soup, right? And faith is a spoon that you dip into the bowl of alphabet soup. You pull your spoon out, there is a name, say Sheshma'a in Pesjet. You dip your spoon back in it again, you pull it out, it says Ma'a Karu, true of voice. These are the same gods. These names are both from the same source, but they kind of allow you to access different aspects of this god.
You mentioned that you began to devote yourself to Thoth, and when it comes to this book, to the Book of Flesh and Feather, you say, quote, "The book you hold in your hands should not be mistaken for a simple book of occult or esoteric knowledge and practice. This is religion." You say, what you are holding is, in its entirety, a poetic ritual honoring the primordial and self-begotten creator, the God of all gods and man, the eternal Father who is, and I love this phrase, crowned in furious light, the thrice greatest, unquote. So can you share about, after this revelatory experience, how this amazing transition to a devotional practice, a religious practice came about?
Once I realized that my focus was to be Djehuty exclusively, I began to read a lot of ancient literature differently. You sort of start to realize that most people's idea of ancient cultures today is that they were all separated by huge amounts of time and space, and that's just simply not true. These were all open religions, and as open religions, they sort of flowed in and out of each other. For instance, there is a wonderful book called The Coptic Handbook of Ritual Power. And in it, there's an epithet for a spirit named Baktiotha. And in the commentary of that book, it says that that translates to the servant of Thoth. So you start to realize, like, even though the Coptic church was, Christian, they were still calling to the same spirits, the same powers that the Egyptians were. They weren't practicing their respective religions exclusively apart, right? They would merge them. And that just kind of opened up this whole world for me, where I started to realize that it was kind of okay to not be so strict about rules of one certain time and place, that Thoth can pop up in any number of places. For instance, the Abraminto formula, which anybody who is familiar with the Greek magical papyri probably knows that name. It's a long palindrome. One of its potential translations is actually Abraminto is referring to Jesus, and then the Thu part of that name refers to Thoth. So then in the Pistis Sophia, when Jesus appears walking on water and intoning the name Abraminto. He's calling on the power of Thoth to elevate him above the water, right? That's just psychedelic. So when I realized that I had a little bit of wiggle room, I guess, that the ancient cultures were testing their own limits, trying to figure out what they could get away with, I just kind of realized that I was free to make my religious practice kind of whatever I wanted it to be. So I tested myself. I tried to make things as crazy as I could, basically, as interesting, as poetic, as dramatic as I could. I made it into an art form. So I produce art now to venerate the greatest god, Djehuty. And in return, my devotion is an art.
The Book of Flesh and Feather includes ritual instructions, exorcisms, spells, amulets, and hymns. Can you just kind of give us a sense in terms of how it's kind of laid out? For instance, are the exorcisms used at specific times to consecrate or exorcise materia magica? Are the amulets made using astrological considerations? Are the hymns done in a specific way at a specific time? Can you just give us some of the layouts?
The Book of Flesh and Feather is written in such a way to induce a state of chaos. If you think about, you get a big box of Legos and you dump them out all over the table, and it's just a bunch of little tiny pieces, right? You don't dump the Millennium Falcon out onto your kitchen table already built. You have the tiny little pieces and you have to shape them in the Millennium Falcon. So this book basically takes you through time and space to a state of disorder and non-meaning, so that with all of the pieces of creation swirling around your head, you have the opportunity to arrange them however you personally want them to be arranged, so they have meaning for you specifically. So this book, while I use it to venerate Djehuty or Thoth, you could just as easily use it to devote yourself to Atum or Isis. This book is simply the very beginning of devotion. While reading this book, I hope that you are able to find a place to begin your own sort of mystery tradition.
Reverend Zemmi, you also mention in the book that, quote, this text is your foundation. You build the temple. So you really stress that this book, although it does have specific devotions and rituals, it's definitely not a cookie cutter kind of approach that, you have to do things a certain way. And instead you encourage people to kind of bathe in the chaos, if you will.
This is a journey that I want the reader to take with me. I'm not trying to push anything on them. As I started to kind of get into the occult scene, I would save up a bunch of money and I would buy a book and I would read it, and I would either like it or I wouldn't. And then I would save up a bunch of money and buy another book, and it would be the same book over and over again, basically. That is not what I wanted to produce at all. So while there are certain amulets in this book, there's an exorcism. There are no planetary requirements, because part of developing your own spiritual practice is developing your own cosmology, your own way to look at the world. So while there are these elements in this book, it is up to you to figure out how to apply them to your life. For instance, if you think about just Hermopolis and Heliopolis, right? Both of these places had their own creation myths, in which Thoth had two very different ways of coming into being. There's also a myth where Thoth was born from the swollen forehead of Sutek. They're all just as real as the last one, right? There's something more true than truth. There's something deeper than reality. They are myth. They are a truth that everyone can agree on. So you start by developing your own cosmology. The Church of Flesh and Feathers cosmology is one that depicts Djehuty coming into being at the very beginning of time and admitting that things exist. And as he admits they exist, they do exist. He pulls from his mind a sturdy ground underfoot and then plants his seed in the ground. From the ground grows a tree that he perches at the top of and sings all of creation into being. So that is the very beginning. That is the point in which all of our magic begins. So we take the chaos and we organize it into something familiar. That is step one of the journey that we call magic. We have faith in God. Our faith in God reminds us that we are capable of beginning the process of reordering the universe. And our cosmology just reminds us where we begin, basically. It's like a save point in a video game. When we want to perform an act of magic, we revert back to that moment. We have faith that it will work. We assume the role of God and then begin to admit that our desired outcome exists.
I absolutely love that, Reverend Zemmi, because so many times when people embark on, I know I've been here where you're embarking on a new practice or something else, a lot of books or a lot of kind of advisement is to, here's a set of symbols or meaning, external meaning, and you need to build it up from there. But what you're doing is the exact opposite. You're saying that because all of us are unique, the only way for you to build something that is idiosyncratic and has meaning for you is for you to first grab that kind of chaos-infused clay and mold it from the ground up. This cannot come from the outside.
Correct. I think there is this misconception that because there is a book published, this is the way that this magic must be performed. But I don't think very many people realize that if magic was a science, I guess, everybody would be doing the same exact thing in every single book, right? There wouldn't be a whole lot of variation. Heart surgery is the same here in Illinois as it is in China, as it is in Canada. That variation in approach is the art of magic, and everyone makes a slightly different art.
Reverend Zemmi, talking about that, magic is known as the art and science. And you mentioned that this book is a restoration of art, saying, quote, "There was a time in mankind's evolution when art was made to celebrate a victory in war, bountiful harvests, to pay homage to the gods. Art now seems, you say, to be mostly created to pass the time. Thus it feels uninspired, boring, or unoriginal. This work was assembled to hearken back to that time when songs were written to honor the gods." I absolutely love that. Can you kind of elaborate on how this book is a restoration of art?
Well, this book was written with a very clear intention to celebrate the greatest god, Djehuty, and to offer oneself to him in exchange for basically the services we have faith in him to provide for us. A lot of the times now, like I said, magic is an art. It's not a science. There is a variation in approach that is more than acceptable. A lot of the times now when people create some artwork, they create it out of boredom, especially right now when we're all locked in our houses. It's like 100 people splattering paint across a canvas and then posting it on Facebook. Well, Jackson Pollock already did that. You know what I mean? We have to figure out a way to do it ourselves so that it has some sort of a meaning for us. And it is certainly okay to dabble in somebody else's approach or to be inspired by somebody else's approach. But it's important, I think, for it to have meaning to us personally.
Can you just kind of share with us, Reverend Zemmi, when it comes to a basic ritual structure, and this is reflected on your Facebook group, the Church of Flesh and Feather, which people can check out. There's bells ringing, there's light. Can you kind of walk us through some of the basic elements that you incorporate in your devotional services to Thoth-Djehuty?
Well, there's a substantial amount of nuance lost in the translation of hieroglyphics into English. One of those nuances is that most of the devotional literature people read is not supposed to be spoken. It is something that is sung. So one of the kind of most important elements of the cosmology of the Church of Flesh and Feather is the image of Djehuty sitting in his tree, singing reality into existence. Because we aim to revert back to the beginning of all of time, our devotional practices are all sung. It's all a song. It is a continuation of the song that has always been sung. So it's from Djehuty's mouth to the earth. It carries our intention across all of creation. Again, because this is an art and not a science, artistic license is certainly encouraged. When you are learning the hieroglyphic language, there are a number of symbols called determinatives that you have to just kind of memorize. They indicate the function of the word before them. So they say if it's an action or a noun, things like that. Utilizing artistic license, though, you can switch those around a little bit. You can make verbs into nouns. So then say like, you can explore the nature of the word voice as an action. You can imbue these words with your own meaning so that they make sense to you placed in a certain order. The rest of it is just like I use a bell because I'm usually holding a camera and I can't play guitar or anything. A bell is just easier. I use what I have around me. So I decorate my shrine with buckeyes. I have a very positive memory from childhood involving buckeyes.
That's one of the things, Reverend Zemmi, I love about your approach is that you literally restore movement and rhythm into the rituals themselves. And as you mentioned, this is not an arbitrary decision because, as you mentioned with ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, which thank you for helping me on the pronunciation before the podcast, which is known as Medu-Neter, these hieroglyphics don't just use verbs, adjectives, and nouns to tell a story, but non-phonetic prompts, as you were saying. So I think this kind of hits at something which I've heard from people who practice even grimoire magic, which is, okay, let's say you're doing a conjuration. Do I vibrate? Do I not vibrate? What's my tonality? Is it forceful? Is it more laid back? How do I do that? And so what you're introducing to readers and practitioners in the Church of Flesh and Feather, it's kind of a subtle kinetics, but it's a kinetics that is infused with, as you say, kind of individual artistic license. Would that be somewhat fair?
Yeah. If you think about ancient Egyptian funeral literature, that was not just a book that got set down next to a corpse and sealed up in a tomb. That was basically like a script. There would be people reading the Book of the Dead over the mummy. There would be a priest presiding over the mummy wearing the mask of Anubis. They were acting these spells out. There's a reason why they're referred to as spells in the Book of the Dead. They are to be performed. So just as it's an art, it's just as much theater as well. Because that element is kind of been lost, I took it upon myself to try to restore it in my book. I utilize the words across the page in such a way as it almost requires you to move at least your head to read them. It is supposed to inspire you to sway your body with the words. You are supposed to adjust the way you recite the words. I'm trying to get you to live this text instead of simply reading it. Ancient Egyptian ritual was not just one person sort of reading from a book, right? This was performed. The audience would participate as well. It was something the whole community shared and brought to life in their own way. That's why community is kind of such a big focus in the Church of Flesh and Feather. We're trying to build a community.
We do have a listener question from Maria, who is asking and saying, quote, "I'm so excited for this book. I have a question. What are some different ways, Reverend Zemmi, people can accentuate or invite chaos into their lives in a safe way, if that makes sense?" Maria says, "I wanted to say controlled chaos, but it sounded too cliche. Thanks."
Well, what a coincidence. I am excited for you to receive this book. I would say the best way to differentiate between the two different kinds of chaos. Think about the serpent of chaos in Egyptian mythology and Sutek. Both are chaotic figures. Sutek was venerated, the serpent never was. If you look at each of their unique forms of chaos, Sutek is chaos moving in the direction of meaning and disorder. Sutek is the shifting sands, but what happens if the sands cover over a city? It provides you with an opportunity to build a new city, right? Whereas the serpent is the chaos of destruction and unmeaning. So the chaos that moves in the opposite direction that the chaos of Sutek is moving. So the first step would be acknowledging that the chaos is surrounding you at all times already. If you think about the weighing of the heart scene in the Book of the Dead, the heart and the feather of Ma'at are supposed to be balanced perfectly, right? Well, say your heart is too pure, too light, and the feather weighs it down. How would you balance the scales? You would allow a little bit more chaos into your heart. It basically gives you permission to create Isfet just a little bit. Some Isfet, some chaos can be productive. The role of Sutek in mythology is a necessary chaos. He was not an evil god. He was a necessary chaos. He killed Osiris, certainly, but he was also the only god strong enough to kill another god in one version of the myth. So reluctantly, he had to kill him because it was commanded of him, basically. In another version of the myth, he kills Osiris, but he is still pure enough to ride in the sunbark with Ra and defend it against the meaningless chaos serpent.
What you're saying, Reverend Zemmi, is that when it comes to chaos, the chaos can be a good thing because it's kind of this pregnant field of potentiality where you can effectively draw and put together your own meaning. But it is important, you're saying, to differentiate between two different kinds of chaos so that you're able to work in the most useful fashion to achieve a result of building your own system.
Yeah, there is the chaos of potential and the chaos of undoing. The first step would be acknowledging the difference between the two and just embracing the chaos of potential, embracing the chaos that opens up a way to new meaning, basically.
You do mention, Reverend Zemmi, that Gnosticism plays a pretty big part in this. And we do have a question from Douglas of the What Magic Is This podcast. Douglas is an awesome guy, a gentleman and a scholar. Douglas is asking, saying, "Hey, Reverend Zemmi, give us a little taste of what contemporary Gnosticism is and what it means in your schema. Is it related in any way to Valentinian or Sethian Gnosticism, or merely takes cues from historical Gnosticism in general?"
Oh man, Douglas, I love your show. Whenever I am down, I turn on the William Blake episode. I so want to geek out with you about Vachel Lindsay, but I digress. The Gnosticism that I have embraced, I embraced, first of all, because I continued to find Thoth in Gnostic literature. As I mentioned, he might be mentioned in the Pistis Sophia. He is probably mentioned in the Coptic Handbook of Ritual Power. He led me to Gnosticism. I fell in love with Gnosticism. I kind of realized Gnosticism is not about any of those names or any of those cosmologies. My practice is Gnostic in as much as I have taken all of these sources from ancient Egypt and Sumer, from the Coptic tradition, from ancient Greece, and I have figured out a way to make it make sense to me in such a way that it yields results. I have interpreted these sources in a way that has power for me.
Reverend Zemmi, to that point, we have a question from Setkin, who's saying, "Greetings, Reverend Zemmi. I am most familiar with Djehuty in his ibis form. I am wondering if you can comment on the god in his baboon form and how or if he is featured like this in your book."
In the book of Flesh and Feather, Thoth exists in any form that you can imagine. Visually, the art in the book is inspired heavily from Coptic magical texts, but of course the ibis is featured, as is the baboon. What is sort of interesting about the ibis, if you think about the epithet Lord of Purity and Djehuty's association with cleanliness, that is an association that's probably born from the fact that the ibis actually invented the use of enemas. I don't know if this is beyond the scope of this podcast at all.
Absolutely not. Go for it.
The ibis is capable of sucking water into its beak and then poking its beak down between its legs and up into its own butt and squirting the water out. And it creates a flushing effect. They don't swallow little stones to grind things up. They just eat their food and then wash it out of their butts when it starts to get clogged up. The baboon is interesting. You think about the effigy in the Shrine of Flesh and Feather is a baboon, the announcer of the morning. In ancient Egypt, well, nowadays we're all familiar with the rooster announcing the morning. In ancient Egypt, the baboon did. The sun would rise, the baboon would acknowledge it by screeching. And if you've never heard a baboon acknowledging the sun, Google it. It's a terrifying thing to hear, which is actually kind of interesting because there is almost like a fear that people would have of their gods, which I think keeps your devotion fresh. If you do not have this fear of your gods, you start to get too casual with them. You start to, well, what I kind of compare it to is like a spoiled teenager who never talks to their parent unless they're trying to get gas money from them. I think being afraid of your God just a little bit sort of reminds you to make devotion something you do every single day, not just when you want something from these gods. The baboonic avatar is interesting because he has ears as well as eyes. So there's another way that he can observe you, basically. When you sit before the god, you know he's listening to you, you know he's looking at you.
Reverend Zemmi, so in that in-between state, after you're kind of building, and probably it's a constant thing of taking from chaos and building your own system, is the idea to continue to grow and develop your own system and your own devotions and strengthen those bonds? Or what's going on right after that initial chaos?
Once you have found the chaos, it is your job to then assemble it however you need it to be. So if you think of our cosmology of Djehuty sitting on his tree, singing existence, singing reality into the cosmos, we go back to the chaos, we assume the role of God sitting in his tree singing, and then we begin to put order to chaos. Most magic seems to be about either forming a relationship, acquiring wealth, or else seeking revenge. So say you want to build a relationship with somebody. In ritual, your goal is to revert back to a state of chaos and then assume the role of God sitting in his tree and singing. As you admit to certain things existing, you move closer and closer to your desired outcome, which is being in a relationship with somebody. And as you progress through time, closer and closer to yourself in the here and now, you move closer and closer to admitting that you are in a relationship with that person until you are in the moment. And then you are admitting that you are in a relationship with that person. The trick is to admit it in such a way that you do not allow yourself the opportunity to doubt its existence. And that is a very difficult thing to accomplish because belief is not something we have any control over. People can say all they want they don't believe in ghosts, but if they ever have to go into a dark, musty basement, inevitably the person always hurries through it. You know what I mean? It was just like when I was kind of saying that I was an atheist. I had that God hole. I wouldn't admit to believing in a God, but nonetheless, I did. I couldn't make myself not believe in a God. In ritual, that is what faith is. It is remembering you have the ability to make yourself believe something right before the moment you have to believe in it for it to be real.
It's almost like creating a kind of esoteric gravity, if you will, where just like a star has gravity and planets kind of helplessly orbit around it, it's just simply creating this kind of gravity of whatever the aim is via embodying the Godhead and kind of causing it just to happen, not forcing it, not thrusting it, not pushing it, but just creating the conditions where it just kind of falls into place.
It just sort of is when you need it to be. Now, because this is an art instead of a science, like I said, you can take a little bit of creative licensing. So you don't actually have to sing out all of time and space, right? You can figure out a creative way to get from the very beginning to the moment of recitation in the here and now through song without it taking eons and eons and eons. Take creative license and figure out an interesting way to get from that state of chaos to your desired outcome over the course of one ritual.
And Reverend Zemmi, too, you mentioned that concluding the work, you say, is, quote, an elaborate initiatory ceremony, which allows the operator to become the Word of God and to go forth as an emanation of the deity, unquote. Can you share a little bit about this? Because I know many listeners are familiar with a kind of initiatory ceremony of the Book of Abramelin and attaining knowledge and conversation with your holy guardian angel. Is this something similar or different? Can you just share with us about this process of this elaborate initiatory ceremony and the meaning behind it?
Well, the elaborate initiatory experience is basically when you reach that point where you are capable of admitting your desired outcome is true without doubting it for one instant. There's a Coptic word for it, logorines, begotten of the word. The reality is born of your word, and you do not hesitate for 1 second to admit that it is real. In ritual, it's sort of important to include things that make you feel like what you are doing is worthy of becoming a reality. Your goal is to get the attention of the gods. So you got to kind of put on a show a little bit. You have to feel like what you're doing is greater than the reality you live every single day. So you move, you dance, you sing, create a space in which a god or a spirit would be comfortable coming into your presence. For that reason, it's crucial that we acknowledge the ancestors. In ancient Egypt, they would actually make little clay houses to sit outside of their houses in which spirits could occupy, and they would include little tiny clay offerings for them as well. They would give names to these spirits that would wander in and out of their houses. In the Church of Flesh and Feather, the sort of genus loci, I guess, is a man named Nicholas Vachel Lindsay. He was at one time the most famous poet in the world, but he's almost not known at all anymore. He did nothing to preserve his legacy, so there is almost nothing to depict him in an occult sphere. This man is one of America's great occult thinkers, though he may not have even realized it. But I mean, he was friends with W.B. Yeats, and there was a reason why Yeats was so fascinated by the guy. It's because Vachel was making the great American myth cycle, as well as developing a form of magic inspired by the ancient Egyptians, wherein your rhythmic chanting, your voice creates reality. He wrote once on a piece of paper, out of rhythm comes words and form. That was his approach to generating change in the real world. He would start with a rhythm, so his voice. He wrote a poem called The Congo, which was supposed to inspire his audiences to humanize African Americans. He died in 1931, so that gives you an indication of what kind of time frame he's working in. And there's a kind of a reoccurring line in that poem, boom lay, boom lay, boom lay, boom.
Can you share about that in terms of using poetics and using rhythm? You also mentioned that there's an acknowledgement of ancestors. Is that something where the names of the famous poets or the names of perhaps people who kind of influenced you or kind of brought you to a specific place are acknowledged and kind of brought into the rite? Or can you share a little bit more about that with ancestors?
Well, I personally, my father was adopted, and there is all kinds of bizarre drama on my mother's side. So I don't know that much about my extended family. So when I approached ancestral veneration, which is everybody in the pagan community talks about it all the time, but when I approached it, I didn't have too firm of a starting place. So I just kind of looked at the life that I was living at the time. And I am a docent at the Vachel Lindsay Home State Historic Site. I am the preeminent Vachel Lindsay scholar, which means very little to almost everybody. But I had this huge admiration for the man. And so I just sort of decided to embrace him as an ancestor. In my opinion, there's something a little bit more profound than blood that can connect two people, and that is choice. You're born into blood, but choice is voluntary. So I acknowledged Vachel, and a huge part of Vachel's career was just venerating the city in which he lived, in which I currently live, Springfield, Illinois. In a way, he was sort of encouraging me to venerate him as an ancestor. He kind of drew me to him. So I basically just I embraced his approach to venerating the ancient Egyptian gods. In fact, Vachel created a form of written language called the American hieroglyphics. He himself could read hieroglyphics with such an ease that it rivaled ancient Egyptian priests. And so he, understanding what hieroglyphics were used for, which was to communicate with the gods, basically, he created the American hieroglyphics with the hopes that it would unite America with the old gods. His signature, his American hieroglyphic signature, includes the glyph of Thoth. And I had that tattooed on my arm, actually. So all of this time, I'm sort of building up this belief in God. Every step forward I would take, I would realize that there has already been sort of like something drawing me in that direction. I basically just leaned into it, and I allowed Vachel to take me wherever I was going to go. And he venerated Thoth above all else.
That's just so wonderful, Reverend Zemmi. It's like building your own poetic and esoteric influences, ancestors, as you say, quote unquote, of choice. And so would this be something that if there are listeners out there who are working through your book, they're building up their own personal idiosyncratic system, that they should look around and consider, okay, what poetry or poets resonate with me and have always resonated with me? What kind of music? What, like, putting together their own kind of tapestry that's woven then into the Book of Flesh and Feather. Can you elaborate on that?
I despise the veneration of celebrities. And so placing certain literary figures in a certain light is like very borderline that. But Vachel, like I said, he was contemporaries with W.B. Yeats, and everybody knows Yeats's contributions to the world of the occult. Vachel had a deep admiration for William Blake. And I think most people can probably agree that William Blake, he said, with regards to religion, I must create my own system or be enslaved by another man's. Vachel was doing the same exact thing William Blake was doing. In fact, if you think of the William Blake painting Newton, it depicts Isaac Newton sitting on this rock, kind of focusing intensely on these papers in front of him. And the rock that he's just treating as some piece of furniture that he's just disregarding is unquestionably the focus of the painting. It's teeming with life. All of the beautiful colors in that painting are on the rock. So I would say don't venerate celebrities, but there certainly are certain musicians. Sun Ra comes to mind. There's certain literary figures, William Blake, Vachel Lindsay, that have sort of started building something that somebody could easily continue. William Blake began building a religion from art. Vachel Lindsay began building a religion from the spoken word. Sun Ra began building a religion from the sonic powers of his piano. Don't venerate celebrities, but there certainly are people of note who kind of presented a stage on which you can build your own religion.
You know, since you started obviously writing the book and practicing your own system, what are some of the biggest surprises that you've had?
One of Djehuty's epithets is he who comes when he is called. Keeping that epithet in mind, if we think about ancient religion, the ancient Greeks would hear the barking of a dog, and they would associate that with the arrival of Hecate. The ancient Sumerians would see the rain falling upon the earth, and they would not just dismiss it as it raining, they would say that was the fists of Enlil pounding on the ground. I think it is important to not dismiss seemingly mundane things happening during ritual. For instance, frequently I will be performing ritual and I will be interrupted by the sound of a train. I live right next to railroad tracks, so it usually rattles my windows. The train is a very huge presence in the room. Instead of just dismissing it, I can acknowledge it as being what it is. It is something that happened at a very appropriate time. I can add meaning to it. Again, in ritual, I am in a state of mind where everything has meaning. I am just sort of arranging it in the way I want it. So don't dismiss seemingly minor events or signs. Embrace them as an epiphany.
Thank you so much for elaborating on that. And actually, Reverend Zemmi, in terms of kind of the broader tradition that this is a part of, we do have another listener question for you from Setkin, who is asking and saying, I am aware of 2 Birth of Djehuty stories from the Kemetic literature, my personal favorite being where he is said to be born of the union of Heru and Set. Can you comment on this and any other Djehuty origin or birth myths that you have studied?
That particular myth is actually kind of a far out one. Heru or Horus tricks Sutekh into eating his own semen, and then he summons it, calls it forward, so it moves out of Sutekh's stomach and forms a bubble on his forehead. From that bubble is where Djehuty was born. But then if you think about the creation myth of Heliopolis, Djehuty was self-begotten. He created himself. In Hermopolis, he stepped forward and he laid the world egg. These creation myths don't matter that much. They only meant something to those people in those cultic centers. We do not live in ancient Egypt. Most of us probably don't even live in Egypt. It doesn't mean as much to us as it did to the people of that time. As a modern practitioner, it should be our goal to develop a cosmology that makes sense to us. For that reason, I do not consider myself a Kemetic. I am not living in the land of Kemet. I am not venerating the land of Kemet, though I do admire it deeply. But these are open religions. So I am taking a god from the land of Kemet, and I am venerating them in North America as the land in central Illinois. So I am a naturist. So for that reason, elements of the cosmology are much different.
When it comes to Thoth-Djehuty and the practice in general, what are, say, 2 or 3 misconceptions people either have about Thoth that you wish that they just kind of understood a little bit better as a baseline? Or if you want to ask the inverse of that question, what are 2 or 3 things that people should always try to remember about working with Thoth-Djehuty?
The realm of unverified personal gnosis is sort of a delicate one to get into, but I would say there is a lot to ancient Egyptian religion that is not understood. Though there are a substantial amount of sources from which you can draw, most of them have not been translated. Most people's understanding of ancient Egypt comes from texts that have been translated by people like Budge, and then other people have sort of modernized a little bit. You'd be surprised how many people do not go back to the hieroglyphic sources to translate themselves. And I get it. Hieroglyphics it's a very difficult language, but there's just a huge difference between what comes directly from the hieroglyphic text and what is said in a translation. Actually, it's probably where the phrase lost in translation comes from. I encourage people to learn the language and then look for those little nuances. It is in one's best interest to focus your devotion all in one direction, basically. So you can find these long lists of epithets of all of these gods, but know that in other locations, there are different gods are referred to by those same epithets. Any epithet can refer to any god. It behooves one to figure out a way to apply each epithet to the same god. It's sort of like focusing all of your attention in one area, focusing all of your willpower onto one task. I have found that Djehuty is a god that does not appreciate wasting his time. If you are approaching Djehuty in prayer, you had better be certain of your words. You better exhaust every option before you approach him with a request. Though he is historically a humorist, he has a very dry sense of humor. He's kind of the Christopher Guest of ancient deities, I guess you could say. Before you invoke Thoth, you should first try to solve the problem yourself. If that doesn't work, then approach the god.
Jack Grail, when he was on, talked about his own invocations and devotions to Hecate and kind of the importance of finding your own rhythm. And I know that, guests in the past have talked about the difference between, say, an invocation that is very lodge style, quote unquote. And I know that there's a ton of difference here and a lot of variation, but like a Golden Dawn kind of vibration versus more of a chanting, perhaps if you grew up in a kind of a Christian environment, versus kind of a more poetic, almost intoning or humming. So is part of this too, in building that kind of your own personal stratification, that you need to really allow yourself to have some kind of breathing room to find what works for you in your specific devotion, to have the maximum, as you say, confidence when approaching Thoth?
Yeah, absolutely. You need to figure out how to do it yourself. Think of it this way. If you are watching somebody perform karaoke, what is more entertaining? Watching somebody read the words as they scroll across the page, or watching somebody get lost in the song that is part of their very soul, something they know frontwards and backwards, right? It's the latter. Now, what seems like more fun, to open a big, huge book and then meticulously follow every instruction exactly as it's written, or allowing yourself to sort of dissolve into this state of ecstasy and allowing words to flow from your mouth however they come, allowing yourself to take hold of the reality in front of you and manipulate it as you see fit? Again, it's the latter. It is crucial you figure out how to do these things yourself. All of these books of occult practice are just somebody figuring out how something worked. They are by no means the only methods. They are just options. And I think to breathe life into somebody else's text, it is crucial that you figure out how to make it your own.
That is such great advice. Such great advice. Reverend Zemmi, there are a lot of people who consider themselves ceremonial magicians, practitioners of, grimoires, etc. And they might see that as something completely different from religion, and that there might be a perception, not just in the esoteric community, quote unquote, but also in kind of general mainstream culture, that religion and giving yourself over to a religion, a systematized institutional religion, is how a lot of people think of global churches, is not a good thing. Can you kind of thread this needle for us between the definition of religion and having a practice?
I feel like it's sort of a mistake to separate magical practice from religion. Basically, no religion has ever done that. That is a relatively new thing. We're talking about the last few hundred years that those two things have been separated. But I think people now are sort of afraid to give themselves over to religious devotion. Whenever they think of religion, they don't think first of something exciting like speaking in tongues in front of a statue of a bird. What they think of is all of the negative experiences they have had within the Christian church. And I think that puts a lot of people off. They don't realize how vast religion can truly be. That's actually sort of part of the Gnostic influence of my religious experience. I have interpreted all of these things as I see fit, as in such a way that makes sense to me.
A Book of Flesh and Feather is available for pre-order now from ThothDjehuty Publishing, which will, of course, make sure to have a link in the video description so that people can definitely check that out. But Reverend Zemmi, can you share with us where else can people find you? If they want to find out a little bit more about the Church of Flesh and Feather, if you can tell us a little bit about that group and really anything else you'd like people to know about either contacting you or where they can check it out online.
Well, you can always get on Facebook. I am ThothDjehuty Thoth, which is very difficult to spell. So you can just type Reverend Zemmi with 2 M's and I'll pop up. On Facebook, we're the Church of Flesh and Feather. And we're just kind of a community of people who kind of all focus our devotion on Djehuty. However, we see Djehuty as being just the name that we assign God. We're more than happy to accommodate however somebody refers to God. We welcome it. In fact, we don't really have tenets. We don't have rules. You know how to be a good person. You don't need religion to tell you how to be a good person. But we encourage you to bow before every shrine. So we've got a YouTube channel as well. We've got a Patreon. Eventually, I would like to be able to rent a space to have a public shrine.
This has been a deeply personal experience for you. And I think readers will definitely get the sense of that through the book. Do you have any advice for readers as they pick up a copy of your book for the first time? Should they go through it systematically? As obviously for me, I know I love having a kind of a notebook right there so I can take my own notes. Any advice as they kind of delve into A Book of Flesh and Feather?
Well, this book is written in such a way as to encourage its continuation outside of the book. There are streams of consciousness included in it, so it basically works to kind of get your wheels going and then allow you to see where you end up. The words are arranged on the page in such a way as to encourage movement as you recite them. This book was written to be the very beginning of your own personal experience with your own personal God. If you call it Djehuty, that's great. If you call it Hecate, that's great. If you call it Marduk, that's great, whatever. This is the very beginning of that for you, though. So I do encourage people to take whatever notes they want right in the margins. Whatever you got to do to make this book your own, I encourage that.
Author, devotee to Thoth-Djehuty, and founder of the Church of Flesh and Feather, Reverend Zemmi, thank you just so much for taking the time and coming on the podcast today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Listeners, I hope you enjoyed that chat with Reverend Zemmi as much as I did. His urging that we all must find our own way to devotion and not to get boxed in by definitions or what others may expect of us is, to me, one of the real keys to successful magic. I mean, if you have two people doing the same thing, the same ritual from the same text, their approaches, styles, ways of moving and intoning will be, and may, actually must be, completely idiosyncratic and unique. Reverend Zemmi's reminder of working with chaos is also, to me, so important to build from the ground up, to generate a unique practice from within and not to be spoon-fed someone else's system. Definitely check out the video and podcast description to get a copy of the Book of Flesh and Feather. And also, thanks as always to each and every Glitch Bottle patron on Patreon. Your questions and thoughts were, as usual, wonderful and elucidating. Also, patrons can hear Reverend Zemmi go deeper into learning hieroglyphics and doing rituals outdoors and more on patreon.com/glitchbottle. You can always subscribe to Glitch Bottle on YouTube, listen to Glitch Bottle on Spotify, Spreaker.com, and Stitcher Radio. As always, this is Alexander F. reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.